without further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to Steve Anderson. Let's give him a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you. It's always good to be back in Kansas. This is actually my home state. I grew up in northwest Kansas. I grew up in a family that was very political. Sadly, though, both of my parents took turns being chairs of the Democratic Party in my home county. They both were smokers, too, so I had some real abuse as a young person. My grandfather served as a state legislator, also a Democrat. I was the first registered Republican in my family. Now, my uncle changed his registration and was Reagan's NSC general counsel in his first term. So I had a little bit of influence, I hope, in changing. But certainly, I did not fit the Democrat policy approach to life. And I left. I didn't want to have anything to do with politics. So I got into being a CPA course, and I did a lot of things. I ran my own business. I wildcatted on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. So I've got a width and breadth of private experience. However, I do have some experiences that really fit with the situation Kansas is in right now, with Laura Kelly sitting in the governor's office. I took 2 years out of practice. Governor Keating appointed me in Oklahoma. Now, when I was appointed in 1998, most people don't realize the situation in Oklahoma at one time. From 1907 to 2004, both chambers were controlled by the Democrats, except for a brief period in 1950 when the Senate was tied. That's how blue of a state it was. In fact, when Keating appointed me, one of the things he told me was that there was enough corruption to keep us busy, and certainly there was. I helped send some of them to prison. And what I saw, though, really prepared me for when Sam asked me to come up here and take a position with the state. Now, I will say I was somewhat reticent. When I came up to meet with Sam the first time, I just thought I was bringing ideas up to him. When he offered me the job, I took it, even though my wife said, "You're going to take a big salary cut." And it did hurt me financially badly, too. But I understood the situation where the state was in. And here, the press did not do a good job of telling this story, but let me give you the background. When I walked in, the last fiscal year had closed with a negative ending balance in the general fund. Supposedly, that can't happen in a state. This state closed, I think it was 28 million negative balance, which is just unfathomable. We had a $550 million budget deficit. Those are the two things I knew about. What I didn't know about, and many of you may not know about, the state of Kansas had been indicted for financial fraud. In fact, we had joined an illustrious group, Illinois, New Jersey, and Kansas. And Kansas was, according to the SEC, the worst of those financial frauds. For 10 years, the state of Kansas had been misreporting on their financials. Now, you probably didn't hear about any of that. The papers didn't bother to print any of that. And I see that Dwayne Gosen was reappointed briefly by Governor Kelly. He was the one that had put out that fraud. So I get into the position. Had I known all of this, when I first went over to my office after Sam had been sworn in, the deputy director tells me, "Go in your office, lock the door, and in your right-hand corner drawer, there's something only you are to see." And when I pulled it out, it was the SEC indictment. And of course, as a CPA, that was putting my neck on the chopping block if that couldn't be fixed. So I called Sam, went back across the street and said, had I known this, I might have considered otherwise. Now, we did get it fixed, but there were a litany of things that were wrong that had been left. So I have some insight into what happens when you follow incompetence and corruption. And I think that's what our president-elect is about to face. So I'm going to try to make this kind of a general talk, but also talk a little bit about the state things I saw, and hopefully we can relate it to the federal. The forces in action. And these are things that a lot of people don't think about. The weebies, change in the political class, the federal and state relationship, which there are some interesting things there that I'm surprised how few politicians know anything about them, and the loyal opposition, of course. Now the weebies, who do you think in DC the weebies are? And the weebies are those ones, and they will tell you, if you've ever been an appointee, you find out really quick. The weebies are the people that weebie here long after you're gone. And they are good at it. Passive resistance is amazing how effective they can be. I saw that when I was working for Keating. You know, it's a weak executive power state in Oklahoma, unlike Kansas, which is a strong executive power state. So he really couldn't bludgeon anything. So we had to take a different approach. And one of those things, and I think I sat on the Republican House PAC from the year 2000 to 2010. During that period, we turned the state from blue to the reddest state in the Union. And what we learned was that policy, if properly presented, would make voters change to conservatives. And I think we haven't done a good job of that in general. But look at those numbers there. In D.C., that's the vote for president. Who do you think the weebies are that they're going to be dealing with? It's not their friends. They'll do everything they can to and this will be difficult for them. Now, the agencies, I always had a belief that there's 3 R's you could reduce, remove, or relocate. On the reduce, it can be difficult. And as you see, Biden laid some things in place to try to make it difficult for Trump. One of the things I found is the demographics of the government workforce favor your ability to draw the workforce down. Now, what I did in Kansas, they appointed me state comptroller too, as well as budget director, in order to fix the SEC issue, and there were some issues with their audit. Is that when I asked for timesheets, you would have thought that I was asking them to turn over their firstborn. Now, they eventually filled them out, and I've got some really interesting ones. One of them, he only worked 1 3/4 hours per week. Now, I did appreciate his honesty, but when I found out what the story was, he was an older person that already had a retirement income, and he was basically just filling out his time. And it is so difficult to fire that they just put him in a corner and let him go. Now, I really couldn't live with that, especially since we had a bit of a budget problem, so I thought it was opportunity. So I asked his direct administrator, what is it that he hated? Well, he didn't like people. So I put him at the front desk as the information source to send. He lasted 2 months. Now, quite a few people quit just when I asked for the timesheet. So there's ways to reduce. Now, the remove is a more difficult one. Some of you may remember, some of the older ones here, when I struck the art agency. The Arts Council, in my first budget, I did away with them. That worked until some of our own people decided that we needed to keep that funding and moved it over to Commerce. So the getting rid of an agency, even in a strong executive power situation like the president's in, is really difficult. What you find out is not only do the agencies have their own employees, of course, that have to be gotten rid of, but there's always those people that benefit from that agency out in the private sector or in the public sector. So the Department of Education, I hope he does get rid of it, but that's going to be tough. The one I really like is the relocate. That does a couple things for you. One, we get the weebies out of that Democrat chorus they live in and move them out amongst America. Now, I think in Trump's first session, you recall, he moved ag to Kansas City. Now, if you look back, we were kind of ahead of that, and I'm happy to say that I knew Stephen Miller fairly well and gave him a little advice when they went in the first time. If you recall, we moved ag to Manhattan, which is where it belonged, at Kansas State University. And we've got NBAF there. It was the perfect place for that. And you would think that would be an easy one. It was like pulling teeth, and the only way we got away with it, even in a strong executive power state, and as dire as our situation was, and as strong of ag secretary as we had with Dale Rodman, we had to give something to get it. Fortunately, yeah, isn't it sad that you have to swap something in order to get something you need? What we gave, and it turned out to be a positive, and it was actually modeled after something my wife did as deputy director of fiscal staff in Oklahoma, was we moved the KBI lab in conjunction with Washburn. And we got Washburn to finance the bond issue for the lab because we were clearly tight on money at the time. So that's worked out really well. The CSI program, I understand, has filled up at Washburn. The lab was in terrible shape. I'm not a big one for government buildings, but if you went into that lab, you would have agreed they needed a new lab. And so we needed to do it as efficiently as we could. So the Washburn deal was the deal we struck. And we announced it the same day we announced we were moving ag. So if you look at the Topeka Daily Capital, above the fold was the CSI program and the new KBI lab. Below the fold was the ag move. We still caught a lot of heck, but we got it done. And that's what I fear. We're going to have to see some horse swapping in D.C. Congressional staff. Now, this is the one that has always bothered me. If you've spent any time in D.C. and you've been around your congressman, you find out some of the staff members maybe aren't on the same page. You spend enough time in D.C., you know, and I saw that in my uncle, who I think when he went to D.C., he was a pretty hardcore conservative. After he left, and he moved out to San Francisco with his law firm, he was what I would call a San Francisco Republican by the time he'd spent some time there, which is not really a Republican. So the congressional staff, I wish more of our congressmen would look at bringing people from the home state there and giving them that lecture. Don't be doing, because I think most of us understand here, very few of our congressmen actually write bills. It's written by staff lobbyists. And those are the two of the important, the lobbyists, you understand their bias. The congressional staff, a little different. And I think that's one of the things we need to tell our Congress people, to hold them accountable, watch your staff. CBO, now the CBO is a huge problem. And there'll be something I'll talk about later. The CBO is, I would be surprised if there's a Republican that's managed to survive in that agency. And the CBO is who controls the fiscal analysis of any tax cut or bill you do, and that can be incredibly powerful. You know, I saw that when I was up here in Kansas. The Kansas Legislative Research Department did all the fiscal analysis. And most people won't remember, but there was quite a furor over when we started doing our own fiscal analysis over in budget. And I'll give you a great example. The Opportunity Scholarship, which is now in place in this state, when we pushed for that bill, there was the pushback from the public education that it was all costs. What they didn't talk about was the savings. So every time a kid left the public school system, went to the private, we saved money. And that part was never in KLRD's analysis. And that's part of CBO. If you look at CBO's work on tax, it is very one-sided. It's what we call static analysis. There's no fiscal analysis, no growth from that money that you put back in the economy. So CBO I singled out there. GAO is the outfit that could do great things. Let's hope Trump goes in there and put some good conservative Republicans in charge, because they're the group that does, well, their name is that Governmental Accountability Organization. I mean, they're perfect to do this job, to go in there and actually look at some of these agencies. In the past, they've done some good work. Their expose on how much of earned income tax credit is fraudulent was huge, but it had zero effect on EITC. EITC is still just as big and as fraudulent as ever. Kansas is one of the states, I'm afraid, that has allowed themselves to be leveraged into not being able to reduce EITC. And we'll talk about that later, how the federal government can tie your hands. And then there's the State Department. The State Department, most people don't realize, is they make deals that don't get analyzed by the CBO. I had my first exposure in the 90s when I was doing an income tax return for an engineer from Columbia who was up here doing some work for one of my clients. Well, I find out that they've made a deal that if you're from Columbia up here earning income in the United States, you pay no federal tax. Now, that made no sense to me. other than I was glad to see my guy I was doing the return for paying no tax. I just wanted to find out what happened. Well, it turns out, as I researched it, the State Department had made an agreement with the Colombian government to allow the DEA to operate in Colombia, and in return, they had given them these benefits. I think what Trump is going to find that a lot of the deals that were made by State Department people. And those deals, I think many of them need to be rescinded if possible. And certainly they all need to be looked at. But the State Department, I'll just say that's one of my big disappointments with Mike Pompeo. I was hoping he was going to go in there and we were going to see mass layoffs. Unfortunately, these people are so entrenched that I think they will be a running problem for Trump. Now here's, when you try to understand why do we get so little, we all know what we believe and what we voted for. Why do we not get that? Now, when you look at this, you want to talk about bipartisan, everybody agrees that they're across the whole spectrum, from Dem to Rep. Everybody agrees that their politicians don't listen to them. Now, why is that? Well, here's the bad news, and I think most of us know that. There is who we're competing against. When you look at the sort of money that's moving around, you can't see the bottom line there. It's almost $500 million. That's in just PAC money that moves. And you can see that's a hard one because let's understand the thing that's most important to 99% of the legislators, being reelected. That is the driving force for way too many of them. And if you want to see how important that is, in Oklahoma, one of the first things we did when we took over was to put in term limits. And if you want to see grown men and women cry, see them when they hit the end of that term limit. And it is amazing to watch Democrat and Republican both cry on their way out as they lose that power. And you see when you look at open seat and challengers money, it's a smidgen of what's being given to incumbents. So it's no surprise that it's hard for our opinions and our contacts with our legislators to move them much when this much money is at hand. Now here's the one that, I hate slides where people read it to you, so I'm not going to read it to you. But you can read it because to me, when I came across this, it's in the CBO's own documents, it sent a shiver up me. Because I started to understand, because that was one of the things that really threw me off when I went to work up here, was the number of programs I couldn't do a darn thing about, because if I did something, that maintenance of effort would kick in. Now, and this is sad, I'm the most published author on maintenance of effort. That should trouble us. You ask any one of your elected officials how well they understand maintenance of effort, and they might understand Medicaid, but that's about the extent of it. And if anyone's interested and wants to be more informed than any politician, if you go to KPI's website, look under my name, you'll find a pretty long and dry document, but I think it's worth the read because you'll know how insidious MOE is and how it has, just as the CBO said, it's how federal policymakers, well, they shouldn't put promote, how they control the state and local level. And it is amazing. When I went in there, we had a huge budget deficit, so I knew I needed to do some scrambling. I find out a third of my budget is already spent because of MOE before I've had a chance to look at one dime. Now that was an eye-opener for me. And then I find out when I walk across the street and talk to people that none of the legislators really understood MOE. Now, the bureaucrats did. And the bureaucrats have done things that comes to EITC. The EITC here is actually tied to SNAP. It was a little trick they used. And so we can't get rid of EITC without losing part of our SNAP money. And that is a little, the sort of bribery you deal with. Now, not surprisingly, when you look at the history of MOE, is born under LBJ, and what a debacle that administration has been in the long run. Now, let's read, those are the two big ones. Medicaid's the one that I shake my head, that we continue to expand it, and they tell you, well, we're losing that federal money. Well, with that federal money comes that MOE. And they lay landmines when Sebelius left, and that's why I know there are some similarities between what Trump will face and what we faced. She went in and created this new expansion of the developmental disabled program that struck the means testing. Literally, that would have bankrupted the state. But it was designed to put the next governor in a bind, because she knew the next governor. Well, Parkinson actually is the one happened on his watch. Sebelius had another little item I'll discuss here in a second. They had put these in place with the idea that it would break any attempt if we tried to cut taxes. In fact, they sent 6 people showed up from DHS, came to Sam's office. They walk in all in black suits and black ties. It was perfect, just the look you expect. And then they proceeded to lecture us how we had no choice because this was already in place. Now, it turns out, as uninformed as I was more informed than anybody at the table, because as I asked them, these are all 1115 waivers. Now, that's something to understand here, that Medicaid was never designed to do all the things it does right now. It was designed pregnant women who are poor, the children under age 18 of the poor, and disabled and blind and aged. That's where all the money was to be targeted there. All the expansions are what they call 1115 waivers. Well, fortunately, when I was working for Keating, I was required to read up on those. And apparently I was the only one, including the lawyers from DHS, that understood that these waivers are renewable every 3 to 5 years. And so as I said, okay, we're just going to let it lapse, and we're going to blame it on you guys. And I will say it's the one time I've seen Sam be really tough, because Sam's one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. I mean, you want Sam to be your neighbor. You want Sam to be in your duck blind. He is a tremendous guy. He's also way too nice. But this is the one time I saw him be tough. And he told him, said, you go back to DC and you tell HHS Secretary Sebelius, we'll make this all about when she was Governor Sebelius. And we never heard from him again. So there's an easy fix to this, and this is the one I'm crossing my fingers for, because I hear him talk it, but I would love to see it done. The block grants, because then when a California who siphons the money off, and don't believe when they say that California only gets 98 cents for every dollar, that comes off the CFA schedule, and it angers me as a CPA when I know how the numbers work. That CFA schedule is only federal funds that flow through the state government. That doesn't count all the funds. So that's BS when California tries to say that. California manages to grub onto every little dollar they can get their hands on by pulling every 1115 and refusing to give us the data to look for fraud. For example, they will not provide the Social Security numbers. Now, I found that out back in the 90s before I went to work. My grandson, when we applied for his first Social Security number, we get a number and then we get a letter from the Social Security Administration say, well, this number's been being used for 10 years out in California. Well, it turns out it was being used for welfare programs. So when the feds asked for this, and we volunteered at Kansas to give them the numbers because they could do the search for us. It would save us some effort, and plus if they kicked them off, it wouldn't make us look as bad. Because let's understand the Democrats. The Democrats do something I call the politics of one. They find that most egregious situation that may be 1 out of a million, and that is all over the mainstream media. So it's always better when you get somebody else to do it, especially when it's the federal government. If they did the block grants, that would stop the abuse of the 1115 on Medicaid. We'd be surprised, I think, how much that would help the budget. Same with education. And education, the interesting part is when you study the budget of education is everybody thinks that it is special ed money that they hold over our heads. The biggest dollars are school lunch program, and that's through our ag program. Now, we always think as an ag state, well, we probably got some control there. Go look at the ag budget. Where most of it goes is social welfare programs. The vast majority. So it is an unholy alliance of red state ag and inner city blue that vote for it every time. And that is a hard group to break. Now, the loyal opposition issue. We got a real dose of it. When we came in, I guess I was somewhat naive. When I worked for Keating, we knew that almost everyone opposed us. And when I came in, in Kansas, we had the governor, and we had a majority in the House and the Senate. Ideal opportunity to get rid of the income tax. And we managed to get that through. However, I will say, and I'm not going to name the person, but there was a key senator that worked with Lori Kelly to kill the income tax. I would be here in a state visiting now that would have no income tax had we not got stabbed in the back. This particular person had a business that had a huge loss carry forward. What happens to a huge loss carry forward when there's no income tax? It disappears. All their clients would have lost their carry forward. So all of a sudden, a person we thought was on the same page with us was working with the opposition. So you never know who the loyal opposition is. And I kind of use the loyal opposition description, and loyal is a real stretch. It's the self-interest opposition. And there is a major irreconcilable hurdle. And the liberals and moderates, and I saw that even with some of Sam's people. They see winning the election as a spoils of war situation. Now it's our people we're going to put in place. We'll just replace their people with our people. That's not how you reduce the size of government. And sadly, that is, as conservatives, we view government as a service delivery mechanism. And we just want them to deliver good services efficiently and effectively. I think that many of us that have been around for a long time, and I look around and I see a bunch of people probably my age, which means you're pretty darn old. There's the old yellow book test. I don't know if you all remember that, where government ought not to be doing anything that's in the yellow pages. And that, to me, I always thought was a great one. When I laid out the first budget to Sam and his team, I had a whole bunch of those things in there. That, well, we get rid of this, we get rid of that, we can move that out. You want to guess how many of them survived? If you say approaches zero, you'd be pretty well right. The totally getting rid of an agency is really tough, even when they're not delivering a service. Because I always laugh like the Arts Council. That's the reason I went after them first. When you saw where the money went, you just kind of had to laugh. One of them was the miniatures of the 7 wonders of the world. Well, I can reach in my pocket and pull out a lint ball that is a replicate of what I consider the 8th wonder of the world, the Cocker City twine ball. Yeah, I think, one of my kids, when we went on vacation, that's the one place they wanted a picture taken, standing by that. But at any rate, these issues right here, this is a fundamental issue that it is really hard to get enough conservative votes to offset the moderates. The Romneys of the world, they just see government that way. The Bushes definitely saw it that way. That was one of the great disappointments of the 2 Bushes, especially the second one. When we went to D.C. when I was working for Keating, we thought we could get, because we had an idea, why don't we put a ramp? Because most people don't realize Medicaid has a cliff. You make 185% or less of the federal poverty limit, you're covered. You make 186%, your benefits disappear. Now, show me a parent who is going to risk their kids' insurance and potential health by making another $5. Not going to happen. So we had an idea that we would build a ramp down and the state would fund it because we happened to be in a good revenue time in Oklahoma. And since Bush was president, we thought, well, surely HHS would listen to us. They didn't give us the time of day. And, you know, when I left it, on the way home, the Secretary of Finance, who was a very shrewd guy, reminded me of that cliche that we should always remember when we talk about people. In the long run, people act in their own best self-interest. So what would happen to HHS if all of a sudden there were less clients? It might shrink their bureaucracy. So, basically we were talking about an attack on their employment. So when you start to understand that, in the long run, now I will say when I went to work on budget, my budget staff, I was told 2/3 of them would quit when I was appointed. To my disappointment, nobody did. But I discovered that I could bring some leverage to them, and that leverage was that self-interest. What I told them was, when anybody quits or moves to another agency, we're not replacing them. We'll take half of your salary and spread that amongst the people that pick up the work. The other half and the benefit load, which the benefit load in Kansas government at the time was 34% of salary. I mean, that's a lot of money. That savings would go to the state. Now, I tried to get other agency heads to do this. I think I'm the only one that did it. And I will say it worked quite well. In fact, it was almost like some of the employees were trying to push others out the door. I think they got $7,000 to $12,000 raises in the time they worked for me. And we actually reduced our payroll. It works. And it's back to that, what Tom Daxon said when we were on the way home. In the long run, people act in their own best self-interest. So there are ways to do it. I hope we see some of those ways going on in D.C. I pray for Trump. I think we are at an inflection point in this country. When I look at the financials, if it is hard to read the federal audited statement. I've actually sat down and done it. And I'm a CPA with a math degree. You'd think I could wade through this thing and understand it. My eyes were crossed by the time I got through. So I have no doubt that the Weebies have an awful lot of control because they know and the people that are coming in don't. I have a very high opinion of Stephen Miller, having worked with him before. And I will say Miller tried something we did in Oklahoma. In fact, my wife was the driver of this too. Well, if you recall how he was going to pay for the wall initially, was a small fee on wire transfers out of the country. Now, you may think that's a small amount. Well, my wife pushed for that in Oklahoma. Now, when you pay that fee, understand that you can once you file a state tax return, you can claim it. Now, that was the interesting thing about these data points. There was enough money came in that 70% of the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs budget is covered by that little transfer fee. Do you know how many people claimed that on their income tax? How many people filed to get it? 0. That's money that was never taxed, that was under the table, would be my guess when you look at that no one is filing a tax return to recover their fee. Something's not right there. But anyway, when he suggested that did not go through, which I was saddened to see that because that would have paid for the wall and it would have also exposed just how much is going on in this country under the table pay. Anybody that's been around migrant workers knows about the EAD program. It's really pretty darn easy to get somebody a green card to work here. And the migrant workers, for a long time, there's been a relationship. However, if you can pay them cash under the table and save money, and people are going to look the other way, why go through the hassle of an EAD when they're crossing the border en masse? So these are all things that I think that they're talking about a crackdown on I-9s. Anybody that's an employer here knows that every employee has to have an I-9 on file. It would be easy enough to swoop through, starting with the big boys first, and crack down on this. I know you may not know this, but when the big dairies moved to western Kansas, I know people familiar when those Pennsylvania dairies moved in. I mean, that was a pretty big deal. That brought value to a part of the state that needed it. Then, of course, it turned out a bunch of their employees were illegal. Now, what we did was we talked to, in fact, Dale Rodman, I didn't talk to him. Dale Rodman went to D.C. and talked to them, give us some time to get EADs. And they were plenty agreeable to go on that approach. So there is no excuse for the illegals. If somebody says, well, you know, there's no way to get them licensed to work here. No, that's not true. The EAD is pretty reasonable. Now, I probably have bored you enough. There's nothing like listening to a CPA who's got a math degree. Yeah. Usually they send me up to clean the free bar out. You know, if there's a line up there, you want me to go up because they'll leave quickly. So, but I'll open up the floor to questions.
If you have questions, be sure to raise your hands high so I can see them, and we'll do the members first. I can see them here.
Okay. Yes, sir. When the DOJ committee comes out with their recommendations for cuts, do you think that every congressman and senator should be on record either supporting or voting against that cut?
I think every Republican better be on record supporting those cuts. I'm going to bet you, though, that you watch a little bit splinter off. Now, the good news is I think this might be the one time the Freedom Caucus is fully on board. But it is amazing, though, who you think is a conservative and will draw down their agency, and there's no movement. I thought with a bunch of Sam's cabinet secretaries that we would see drawdowns. There's something about when people start bringing you coffee and being really nice to you, you go soft. In fact, that's what I told Sam on the way out the door. I've gone soft in 3 years. How bad do you think your cabinet people are? And that's what I fear. I fear that the agencies will capture them fairly quick, and those cabinet secretaries won't follow through. That is my fear. I hope I'm wrong. But I have seen it too much where everybody gets in the caucus and says, oh yeah, we agree, and then they splinter. Now, usually you have to deal with, and this is it's just a name, so don't bear against me for it. There's and every legislator, and I've worked all over the country now. After I'd worked for Keating, we had so much success there that I picked up a number of contracting with Christie in New Jersey and McDowell in Virginia, doing work on budget for them. It's hard. It's hard to get people in line. The crazy eight are always a problem, and there's always those ones that, and they splinter off. So when you have a small margin, and you're crazy eight, and the crazy eight's just it's not that there's eight. They're just and every legislator has those ones that are so idealistic that compromise is impossible, and that's always a difficulty. And so what I fear is that the crazy eights will find some reason to have a problem with any DOJ issue unless it's absolutely in line with them. And as small as the majority is, that they can't get it through. But I hope I'm wrong.
Good to have you here, Steve.
Good to see you again.
When are you going to go to work in Washington, D.C.?
No.
We'd like to have you.
Not only did I lose money the first time when I came up here, a lot of people don't realize my partners were extreme Democrats. I ended up, they dipped into my partnership account. I had to sue them when I got, that's how, what working for Sam got me was an awful lot of hate mail. Now I will say, on the hate mail thing, when I went after the arts, those people are really imaginative. I've got to give them some credit. Some of it was darn funny. But
it strikes me that our local and state officials don't realize that when they accept $1 from the federal government, that we give up part of our sovereignty.
yeah,
And that money that goes into bureaus that are the administrative state, it also takes away from our sovereignty.
absolutely. You nail that. And you ask your elected officials how much they know about maintenance of effort. Just ask them. Well, I'll give you another example of a maintenance of effort that bit us in the butt. And pardon my, I worked on the oil rigs and put myself through college throwing chains, so I'm a little crude, forgive me. You remember the Holcomb coal plant that was going to occur? Yes. And that would have been a big employer, big tax base for that region. I mean, that was a coveted plant. Well, what Sebelius Parkinson did on the way out the door, maintenance of effort is not always a dollar thing. The environmental, the EPA, the state enforces a lot, in fact, most of the environmental rules. And so what they require you to do is be at least the minimum of what the federal regs are. Well, you can go above and beyond like California does and put in additional requirements. Now, the little catch-22 here is, once you do that and the EPA approves it, if the state tries to renege on it, they come and enforce it. So she put in some things that would prevent the Holcomb plant from ever being built. And that was my first exposure to the non-dollar MOE. And that's why I wrote that piece that's out there on KPI, because I think if legislators understood the strings that are being attached sometimes, they would stop these things, or at least know about them and maybe be prepared going forward. But and I understand why they don't. It's kind of like tax law. You try to read tax law, there's one sentence that's longer than the Gettysburg Address in it, and your eyes glaze over. If you start reading some of the MOE stuff, about halfway through you go, I don't know what the hell I just read. It doesn't make much sense. But the bureaucrats understand it and know how to enforce it. But the Holcomb coal plant, that's why that never occurred, is she left that in place. And I fear that the Biden administration is far smarter than Sebelius was and have left a lot more in place. A lot more landmines are out there.
Okay, we got a question in the back here, David.
Your MOA with the grants got my attention because I work for the Veterans Foreign Wars under a grant from Kansas Commission of Veterans Affairs. We did so for many years and with no problem. Then Kelly fired the director, hired a new one, and immediately we started having problems. We did not trust him. We asked for an audit because we had nothing to hide, and now the audit was supposed to be for Kansas Commission of Veterans Affairs about our grant money, and now we're the criminals when we have nothing to hide. And it's like Kelly's people are trying to turn the tables on us, making us the criminals when we asked for the audit.
And that's a tough one. Surprisingly, the ones that actually have control over that, because I've had to deal with some of those at the Department of Health, the feds might actually be your friend there, depending on what Kelly did. The feds are the one that usually the state does an audit. That's another little thing that's a problem in this. We have an awful lot of financial statements and work being done by people that in the private sector would never be allowed to do that work. Most of the audits that are done by state government would never be certified in the private sector. The people are not qualified to do it, and the sort of audit they turn out is not competent. But yet there is an exclusion under the GASB, Governmental Accounting Standard Boards, that if I'm an outsider as a third-party CPA firm, I have to pass the federal grant audit standards in order to be able to do it. You know who doesn't have to is state people. If you're a state employee, you could be someone who got a degree in marketing and you could still do an audit, and they would allow that. And I have to say I have seen some state audits that are really ugly. The federal MOE people might actually be somebody that you would want to talk to about that, because that may be the way to approach that.
Okay, question here, are you finished?
Yep. Ready?
John, okay.
Mr. Anderson, there are many elderly people and they have to pay a lot of money property tax. The one source of income is social security and the pension plan, that's not enough to meet all the expenses. Is it possible for you to reduce or eliminate property tax?
Yeah, the problem with property tax is it's not a state issue. It's a local issue. Now, the problem I've always had with property tax is how do they arrive at the millage? And they back into it. I always thought that was interesting. There's some interesting budgets I could back into for my wife. Everything would be spent on duck hunting. But I've always found that interesting, that is the way that it works. We decide how much money we need, and then we calculate our millage. So that's a little bit problematic. Now, there's been some great county commissioners and city councilmen that have tried to reduce property taxes. It's tough to do because, as you may or may not know, the state maintains state highways. They don't do infrastructure in your cities and towns unless you get a special grant to do it. The feds give us limited money. It's basically for the interstates and to do the safety stuff. But that's about it. Most of your infrastructure locally is out of that property tax. Now, the one thing I've always said with the property tax, and I think is a big issue for older people, and when I look at mine in Oklahoma, 70% of it goes to the schools. And what am I getting for that? Especially since I sent my kids to private school. And that's one of the things I love about private school. And that was another thing I put on that when we did the calculation on fiscal impact, the Opportunity Scholarship. I noted that, there's no property tax attached to these schools that have private schools that do the Opportunity Scholarship. That is one of the beauties of private, is that they don't get any property tax. So that's why I kind of push for more school choice. Now, I will say Oklahoma's on the verge of true school choice. We've got a couple good programs down there now that we're starting to fund to the point that we can get a lot of kids out of the system. But boy, I wish I could help you on property tax. That's one, it's a local issue. And there's an awful lot that goes on. I will say the Kansas Governmental Accounting Standard Boards, when I was on it, we did manage to flag something they used to hide from you called TIFs, the tax increment financing, which was basically a giveaway that they then hid from the average taxpayer because it was not in the financial. When I was on the Government Accounting Standard Board here, we brought it up, and I happened to know somebody that was on a GASB advisory board, and we managed to push that through. And so GASB makes that a requirement now, so you see the cost of TIFs now on your city and county financials. That's the only thing we were able to accomplish there. I'm sorry, that's not much, but at least you know how bad you're being ripped off. So.